welcome to the Palmer Performance Workshop. Today we're going to talk about a little bit of a taboo subject, engine failures, and specifically the 2015 onwards R1. Now, obviously there's been some revisions with the R1s over the years, but actually a lot of the main components of the engine have stayed the same since it was first released in 2015. So this is kind of relevant to all of them. What we've got in here is we've actually got a customer bike that gets raced in Spain, and it's had an engine failure. Now, we haven't pulled it apart yet, so we don't know what it is, but I thought we'll record stripping it down on a time lapse, have a look through it, and then go through with you guys why we think it may have failed. Stay tuned. Right, let's get this engine stripped. So we're going to start on the top end first. Got most of the little ancillaries off, and we'll pull the spark plugs out and then take the rocker cover off. I use these little strip trays for when I'm disassembling the cylinder head, and all the valves and valve shims and everything will go in those trays in order so they don't get mixed up. So anyway, that's the rocker cover off. Now, I've already taken the alternator cover off, and you can see there I'm turning the right hand side of the crankshaft, but the cams aren't moving. It looks like the crankshaft has snapped. So we'll take the cams out. We can't turn the engine to the normal place where you would remove the cams, so we're just going to have to remove them where they are. Just evenly undoing the cam carrier caps. There we go, that's the inlet cam out and the exhaust cam out. And then we'll take all the valve shims out and put them in that strip box, and then we can think about actually unbolting the cylinder head itself. There we go, it's just picking the shims out with a little magnet on the stick. And just taking off a couple of little more ancillaries before we move the cylinder head. Breaker bar out to undo the big bolts. Now, some people would just gun these out, but I tend to like to just crack everything off by hand first before then spinning them out with one of my Milwaukee tools. That's pulling the bolts out with the magnet on the stick again. I think that's World Superbikes on in the background. I like listening to stuff while I'm working. And then there we go. So you can see all the exhaust valves have hit. That's basically because the crank sort of snaps around here, a bit like the GSX-R in one of my other videos, and then it means the cam timing goes out of sync. So you can see now, like when I'm moving the crank, but the cam chain isn't moving. So yeah, bit gutting for the customer, this one. The only thing I would say is this bike spends most of its time racing in Spain, and the rider is exceptionally hard on it, especially on downshifts, and every time I've gone out there and worked with them, I've told them that he needs to calm it down. So that is probably my best guess as to why this has done this. The spark plugs look a little bit on the lean side as well, so I need to check with them what they've been doing on the mapping side of things. It might even be that it's due a new fuel pump as well. Although having said that, although the spark plugs look a little bit lean, the pistons don't look too bad. So yeah, we'll get the rest of it apart and see what we can salvage. Hopefully it hasn't damaged the cases, which normally can happen. If it hasn't, then it'll just be a case of a new crank, new rod, probably a new set of exhaust valves and a few bits and pieces, and get it all built back up again. Right, let's get the old time lapse back running and get the rest of it apart. Here we go, let's get the bottom end stripped. So we'll get the oil cooler off and out of the way, and the various oil feed pipes. Cam chain timing side cover off. We'll go for the clutch next, get the old Milwaukee gun out to get that out, and just check in the clutch pack thickness before I put that in the cupboard to one side. Clutch basket out. Various brackets and odds and ends off, and then we'll need to flip the engine the other way up to be able to remove the sump and access the rest of the crank bolts. And now oil pump out, sump off, oil pump out, everything else out. Get on the main journal bolts and everything out, and we can pop the crankcase halves apart. So here we are, one R1 bottom end in half. Now obviously this is your crank and your rods, cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the side that's broken, as you can clearly see there. Damaged the crankcase there, unfortunately, where it's whipped about after it's broken. So these cases are going to be for the bin, unfortunately. But let's talk about why this can happen. Now, these later engines from 16 onwards, they had crankshaft thrust shims here to stop the crank moving side to side. There were people who said, oh, on the 15 models, what would happen is, because they didn't have those thrust washers, that the crank could move far enough sideways for this, the flywheel weight, if you like, on the crank to hit the balance shaft gear. Now, not being funny, that was bollocks. That's not what happens. There's not enough float on those earlier ones to be able to do that, in my opinion. What you do get after the crank snapped, because the balance shaft goes out of time with the rest of the crank, is the balance shaft tends to hit the rods. So you can see that one's hit there. And then if I just take this bit out, you can see that one's hit there. So, and that's just something that's happened after the crank snapped and everything's gone out of time. But let's talk about why this could happen. Now, we saw, one of my earlier videos, the GSX-R had done a similar thing, and the GSX-R has a similar setup actually. So you've got your 4 pistons, and they're driving through this, your primary drive gear. So they're putting power through there. So power is coming from that rod into that rod through to there, that rod through to there, that rod through to there. So actually all the load, the main load, is going through this gear. There's not really any load on this gear, certainly not when you're under power. All this side of the crank is doing is driving the cam chain, so it's driving the cams and valves. So that's actually quite a significant amount of load. And also the balance shaft. Now that is quite a big, heavy lump to be driving. And in my opinion, knowing how this particular engine gets ridden in Spain and seeing the data logging from it and such like, and it's something I always say to customers, revs is what kills R1 engines. And when these first came out, they sounded so much lazier than anything else that most people who bought them were used to riding. There was a lot of failures, and I think most of that was down to people over-revving them, back shifting too quickly on them, and pushing the revs, mechanically pushing the revs past the rev limiter. And from the data from this rider, because they do have data logging on the bike, you can see where he's done that on downshifts, especially at Jerez, coming into turn 1, back shifting second gear and pushing it over 15,000 RPM on the back shift. So in an engine braking scenario, yes, you've got a slipper clutch, but that only sort of helps to a certain extent. But if you shift down the gears too quick, your rear wheel is pushing through the clutch and it's mechanically forcing the engine faster than it wants to go. And that drive's all coming from this gear. But then this has all got resistance on it. You're trying to force the balance shaft and all the cam chain and valve train gear to slow down quicker than it necessarily may want to, and also making it go faster than it's probably really designed to do as well. And that's going to put torsion between this and this. And ultimately, I think that's what breaks these cranks. Now, you could argue, well, they're a weak point, but, and this, this can also be, this is going to be, fatigue related. It's not happened because he's over-revved it once. It's happened eventually after, a season's worth of racing. I think this engine, if I remember right, the crank in this is actually 2 seasons old. So it has done a bit of work. So, fatigue is an issue here. But doesn't, ultimately, if you force it to do something it's not really designed to do, it will fail. And as far as I'm aware, I've been working on these engines now for 9 years, since they came out in 2015. And there are race bikes I know of that I built back then, which are still going strong, and they haven't been touched or had a new crank in them. But I think so much of it comes down to a little bit of luck and how they're looked after and how they're, ridden by the rider. But, like I say, pretty much 9 years of looking after these bikes, and I have seen snap cranks before, I've seen thrown rods before, but never actually on one of my own customer builds. So I was a little bit disappointed really to see this, but then like I've said, I know this particular rider's very hard on it, so on his bike, so it probably was only a matter of time. Now the downside is now he's going to have to buy a new engine really, because by the time we bought a new crank, replace the rods, replace the pistons, replace the exhaust valves, replace the crankcases, it kind of becomes a bit of a uneconomical repair. So we will get a new engine from Yamaha, we'll put the Nova close ratio gearbox in it, we'll do a bit of head work on it, get it all built back up, send it up to Spain, send it back to Spain to finish this season. Just one other thing I thought is worth to mention. R1s have titanium con rods. Titanium, when it's sort of cold, is more brittle than when it's warm. So a very important thing with R1s is to actually make sure that before you go out on track that the bike is fully warmed through and at normal operating temperature. If it's at normal operating temperature, the chances of breaking a con rod are lower than if you've gone out when it's cold and sort of given it full beans from the off. So just something worth bearing in mind. And there we go. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm sure it's going to create a bit of discussion as to people's theories as to why they break and stuff. Yes, there is an argument that Yamaha didn't make them strong enough, but the counter argument there is that there's plenty of them still riding around that haven't had a problem. So I think so much of it comes down to external parameters, you know, how the rider treats the bike, how often components are replaced and such like. So certainly with this particular rider, I'm going to do some more work with them, maybe go out to Spain and look at trying to change the way they ride so they're not so abusive on the downshifts. You know, hopefully we can avoid this happening again. And if he keeps riding it like that, then maybe we'll look at replacing the crankshaft more often, because, you know, fatigue is a thing. You know, the more often a crank is forced to do that, the chance of it failing earlier is so much higher. So anyway guys, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll catch you soon.